There is a fermented Japanese food linked to a 21% lower risk of cardiovascular death in a study of 90,000 adults, and most Western diets contain nothing like it. What follows isn't random. It's a system. One island nation layering antioxidants, fermentation compounds, and rare molecules into every meal for centuries. Number 7 was reserved for samurai before battle. Number 2 was ground into powder by Zen monks to endure 18-hour meditations. Starting at number 10, daikon, the long white radish that anchors Japanese winter cooking and has quietly been the country's digestive and skin tonic for well over 1,000 years. You've seen it grated on the side of a tempura plate or floating in miso soup. But its role in Japanese households ran far deeper than garnish. In rural villages across Honshu, daikon was harvested late in autumn, sun-dried on bamboo racks into strips called kiriboshi, and eaten through winter to counter the heaviness of preserved fish and salted foods. Edo period physicians prescribed it for sluggish digestion, dull complexion, and what they described as stagnant blood. What modern research has uncovered explains the tradition. Daikon is rich in isothiocyanates, a family of sulfur compounds also found in broccoli and wasabi, but in a form particularly abundant when the root is grated fresh. Studies published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry have shown that these compounds activate phase 2 detoxification enzymes in the liver, accelerating the clearance of oxidative byproducts that drive skin aging and cellular damage. A 2016 clinical study found that a daily serving of grated daikon for 12 weeks reduced a liver enzyme marker of oxidative stress by nearly 18% in middle-aged adults. Its enzymes, including amylase and protease, also break down starches and proteins in the gut, which is why Japanese meals traditionally pair it with fried or fatty dishes. There's also a vitamin C content that rivals citrus, concentrated just under the skin, which supports collagen synthesis and slows the breakdown of skin elasticity over time. Practically, the ancient approach still works best. Grate a 2-inch piece of fresh daikon raw. Eat it within 10 minutes before the enzymes degrade, and add it to heavier meals 2 or 3 times a week. Pickled versions like takuan preserve fiber, but lose most of the enzymatic punch that makes the raw root so effective against the internal oxidation that shows up, eventually, on the face. And that brings us to number 9, goma, the black and white sesame seeds that Japanese cooks toast, grind, and sprinkle across nearly every form of cooked vegetable. In Japan's Shojin Ryori tradition, the Buddhist temple cuisine developed over 1,000 years ago, sesame was considered a pillar, one of the few dense sources of fat and protein monks relied on for longevity and mental clarity. Temple records from Mount Koya describe elderly monks in their 80s and 90s still walking mountain paths, and sesame paste, known as neri goma, was central to their daily diet. The science has caught up with the monks. Sesame seeds contain 2 lignans, sesamin and sesamolin, which are so distinctive that researchers have built entire clinical programs around them. A 2019 randomized controlled trial published in Nutrition Research showed that 60 milligrams of sesamin daily for 8 weeks lowered oxidized LDL cholesterol, one of the strongest drivers of arterial aging, by just over 10% compared to placebo. Separate research has shown sesamin inhibits an enzyme called delta-5 desaturase in a way that shifts the balance of inflammatory fats in the body toward less aging-promoting forms. There's also evidence that sesame lignans support hepatic vitamin E retention, extending the protective window of one of the body's most important skin and brain antioxidants. A clinical study on postmenopausal women found that 50 grams of powdered sesame daily for 5 weeks improved blood pressure and reduced markers of oxidative damage to DNA. The key is preparation. Whole sesame seeds pass through the gut mostly undigested. Japanese households use a small ceramic mortar called a surabachi to grind them fresh just before eating, which is what unlocks the linens. A tablespoon of freshly ground sesame over rice, greens, or soup 3 or 4 times a week is how centuries of temple cooks quietly outlived their contemporaries. Black sesame carries slightly higher levels of the anthocyanin pigments that add another layer of antioxidant protection. Number 8 is umeboshi, the wrinkled, intensely sour pickled plums that sit in the corner of a traditional Japanese breakfast tray and have been called the samurai's field medicine for good reason. Warriors in the Kamakura period carried umeboshi in their rations because it staved off fatigue, disinfected questionable water, and calmed the stomach on long campaigns. Village grandmothers, or obachan, still press one into rice balls given to sick children, trusting a tradition that runs back more than 1,000 years. Umeboshi is salt fermented for months, sometimes years, and that process transforms the unripe fruit into a concentrated source of citric acid, polyphenols, and a unique compound called mumfuril. Research from Osaka City University has shown that mumfuril improves blood flow by reducing red blood cell aggregation, which is one of the silent mechanisms behind age-related fatigue and dull skin. A 2012 study in the Journal of Medicinal Food demonstrated that umeboshi extract inhibited the growth of Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium linked to chronic stomach inflammation and gastric cancer, by over 50% in test conditions. The same polyphenols appear to neutralize reactive oxygen species in liver tissue, reducing fatty deposits that accelerate metabolic aging. Japanese researchers studying centenarians on the main island have repeatedly noted umeboshi consumption as a daily pattern. There's also evidence it stimulates saliva and gastric acid production, which improves nutrient absorption, a factor that tends to decline sharply after age 50 and drives a range of deficiency-related aging patterns. The practical dose is small. Half an umeboshi with breakfast, or one whole in a bowl of hot rice porridge when you feel run down, is the traditional approach. Look for traditional umeboshi, made with just plums, salt, and red shiso leaves. The bright red, sugar-sweetened versions in Western supermarkets are nutritionally a different product entirely. The traditional umeboshi, aged for at least 12 months, is the one carried in the data and in the centuries of household practice behind it. Sliding into number 7, shiitake, the dark, rich mushroom cultivated on oak logs in the forests of Oita and Miyazaki for more than 800 years. Shiitake was reserved for samurai and the imperial court during the Muromachi period, treated as tribute rather than common food, and Chinese medical texts from the 14th century already described it as a remedy for low vitality and poor circulation. It was said that regular consumption kept the face youthful and the limbs strong. The modern research is remarkable. Shiitake contains 2 compounds that don't appear in most other foods at comparable levels. The first is lentinan, a beta-glucan polysaccharide that has been studied in Japan as an adjunct cancer therapy since the 1970s and is approved there as a prescription immune modulator. Clinical trials have shown lentinan enhances natural killer cell activity, a marker of immune system youthfulness that declines sharply with age. The second is erytadinine, a compound almost unique to shiitake, which in animal and human studies has been shown to lower LDL cholesterol by inhibiting an enzyme pathway in the liver tied to methionine metabolism. A 2015 human study from the University of Florida found that daily consumption of about 5 ounces of dried shiitake for 4 weeks improved multiple immune markers, including gamma-delta T-cell activity by over 50% and reduced inflammatory C-reactive protein. Shiitake is also one of the few natural food sources of vitamin D2, which forms when the mushrooms are exposed to sunlight after harvest, and vitamin D status is one of the most replicated predictors of biological aging pace. The traditional preparation is simple. Dry the shiitake in direct sunlight for a few hours before cooking to activate the D2, then rehydrate and simmer in broth. 3 or 4 times a week, as the court cooks in Kyoto understood, is all the body needs. The dried form holds the active compounds far better than fresh. At number 6, we reach wakame, the silky dark green sea vegetable that the women divers of the Japanese coast, the ama, have been harvesting by free dive for more than 2,000 years. Wakame appears in miso soup across every Japanese household, but its real reputation was built in the coastal provinces of Iwate and Sanriku, where fishing villages showed dramatically lower rates of breast cancer and cardiovascular aging than inland populations, a pattern epidemiologists spent decades tracing back to seaweed consumption. The compound driving most of the research is fucoxanthin, a carotenoid responsible for wakame's brown-green pigment. Fucoxanthin is unusual because it targets visceral fat specifically, and a 2010 clinical trial published in Diabetes, Obesity, and Metabolism showed that daily fucoxanthin supplementation for 16 weeks reduced liver fat and body weight in obese women while improving insulin sensitivity. Visceral fat is one of the strongest drivers of inflammatory aging, and the mechanism appears to involve uncoupling protein 1 expression in fat tissue, essentially instructing the body to burn stored fat as heat. Wakame also contains fucoidan, a sulfated polysaccharide with antiviral and anti-tumor effects in dozens of published studies, and a broad mineral profile, iodine, calcium, magnesium, iron, in forms the body absorbs readily. Research on long-lived populations in Okinawa has consistently identified regular seaweed intake as a factor in preserved thyroid function into the 80s and 90s, and thyroid decline is one of the least discussed engines of fatigue, weight gain, and skin thinning in middle age. A Japanese study tracking over 50,000 women found that those eating seaweed 5 or more days per week had a significantly lower risk of thyroid cancer than rare consumers. Soak dried wakame for 5 minutes, add it to soups or salads, and aim for 3 to 4 servings per week. That's the AMA rhythm. The divers themselves, many still working into their 70s and 80s, became an early example of a population aging more slowly than their workload should have allowed. Number 5 is miso, the thick aged paste of fermented soybeans that anchors the Japanese diet the way bread anchors the European one. Miso's origins trace to Buddhist monasteries in the 7th century, where monks brought koji fermentation techniques from China and refined them into a product aged anywhere from 6 months to 3 years. In feudal Japan, miso was so central to daily strength that samurai armies transported it in dried form, and some regional varieties were considered medicinal enough to be prescribed by physicians for wasting conditions and post-illness recovery. The science of miso is built on what fermentation does to the soybean. The koji mold, Aspergillus oryzae, produces enzymes that break down proteins into bioactive peptides, some of which act as natural ACE inhibitors. The same mechanism as common blood pressure medications. A Japanese cohort study of over 40,000 adults found that regular miso soup drinkers had significantly lower rates of hypertension and stroke despite the sodium content, a paradox researchers attribute to these peptides and to melanoid, the brown compounds formed during aging. Melanoidins act as prebiotics in the gut and as antioxidants in the bloodstream. Fermented miso is also a source of isoflavones in their most bioavailable aglycone form, which has been linked in population studies to reduced breast cancer risk and preserved bone density in postmenopausal women. A 2013 study on aged miso showed it contained compounds that protected DNA from radiation-induced damage, a finding with roots in post-war research on Nagasaki survivors who consumed miso daily. The practical key is preparation. Boiling miso destroys the live cultures and the enzymes. Japanese cooks dissolve miso into soup only after it has been taken off the heat. A single tablespoon of unpasteurized miso in a bowl of warm broth, most days of the week, is the pattern associated with the longest-lived populations in Japan. The darker, longer-aged varieties like Hacho miso carry the highest concentration of melanoidins and bioactive peptides. Now we arrive at number 4, the Okinawan purple sweet potato, known locally as beni imo, and the single most consumed food in the diet of the Okinawan centenarians, who for decades gave the world its highest concentration of people over 100. Before American fast food arrived on the island in the 1970s, beni imo was not a side dish. It was the staple, eaten at nearly every meal, cultivated in the red volcanic soil of the southern islands since the early 17th century, when it was introduced from the Philippines to prevent famine. The deep violet color is the critical clue. Beni imo contains an exceptionally high concentration of anthocyanins, specifically peonidin and cyanidin glucosides, at levels that rival or exceed blueberries per gram. Anthocyanins cross the blood-brain barrier and have been shown in controlled human trials to improve cerebral blood flow and slow cognitive decline markers in older adults. A 2017 study in the Journal of Nutrition demonstrated that 12 weeks of anthocyanin-rich purple sweet potato consumption significantly reduced systolic blood pressure and improved endothelial function, the health of the inner lining of blood vessels, which is essentially how medical researchers measure vascular age. Beyond anthocyanins, beni imo has a remarkably low glycemic index despite its sweetness, a quirk of its resistant starch content that feeds beneficial gut bacteria rather than spiking insulin. The Okinawan centenarian study, which tracked over 700 people over 90, found that calorie for calorie, their diet was far more nutrient-dense than the Japanese mainland average, and beni imo was the single largest contributor to this density. Steam or bake the sweet potato whole. Microwaving and frying destroy a significant fraction of the anthocyanins. A medium-sized beni imo 3 or 4 times a week, substituting for white rice or bread, is the pattern Okinawan elders kept for their entire lives. If the flesh isn't deeply purple throughout, the anthocyanin load is a fraction of what it should be. Number 3 is kombu, the thick dried kelp that forms the foundation of dashi, the stock at the heart of nearly every Japanese savory dish. Kombu cultivation in Hokkaido's cold northern waters was formalized in the 8th century, and by the Edo period, kombu was so valuable that it drove trade routes connecting Hokkaido to Okinawa, producing what historians call the Kombu Road. Okinawans, who don't cultivate kombu themselves, somehow ended up as the world's highest per capita consumers of it, and they also became the world's longest-lived population. That correlation is not coincidence. Kombu is the most concentrated natural source of iodine in the human diet, but that's only the beginning. It contains fucoidan, the same sulfated polysaccharide found in wakame, but at higher concentrations. And a 2011 Japanese clinical study found that fucoidan supplementation reduced the side effects of chemotherapy and improved survival time in advanced-stage cancer patients. Kombu is also extraordinarily rich in glutamic acid, the amino acid responsible for umami taste, which has been shown in human research to increase gastric vagal nerve activity, improving digestion, nutrient absorption, and satiety signaling in ways that counteract the metabolic decline of aging. Perhaps the most striking finding concerns kombu and arterial aging. Alginate, the soluble fiber in kombu, binds cholesterol and bile acids in the intestine, and Japanese studies have linked regular kombu consumption to significantly lower rates of atherosclerosis. A 2018 meta-analysis reviewing 20 studies on seaweed intake found a consistent inverse relationship between consumption and cardiovascular mortality. The traditional preparation preserves everything. Soak a 4-inch piece of kombu in cold water for 30 minutes to make dashi. Then use the softened strip in soups or simmered dishes. Avoid boiling kombu directly, which releases bitter compounds and degrades the fucoidan. 2 or 3 uses per week is the Okinawan rhythm, and the softened kombu strip remains potent after the dashi is made, which is why Japanese home cooks reuse it in a second dish rather than throwing it away. Closing in on the top of the list at number 2, matcha, the powdered green tea that Zen monks ground on stone mills for hundreds of years to sustain focus through 18-hour meditation sessions. Introduced from China by the monk Isai in 1191, matcha became the center of a ceremony, a discipline, and ultimately a documented compound system that no other tea in the world quite matches. Isai wrote a book called Kissa Drinking Tea for Health, arguing that matcha was a medicine that lengthened life, and 8 centuries later, the research community has confirmed more of his claims than not. Unlike steeped tea, matcha is consumed as the whole leaf in powder form, which multiplies the dose of every active compound by roughly 10 times. The headline molecule is epingalate, EGCG, the most studied catechin in nutritional science. A 2020 meta-analysis covering 16 randomized controlled trials found that daily EGCG intake significantly reduced LDL cholesterol, fasting blood glucose, and systolic blood pressure. Separate research has shown EGCG activates a pathway called AMPK, which is one of the central regulators of cellular aging and the same pathway targeted by the diabetes drug metformin. Matcha is also the richest dietary source of L-theanine, an amino acid that crosses the blood-brain barrier and promotes alpha wave production, the brain state associated with calm focus. A 2017 study in the journal Nutrients showed that matcha consumption improved attention and reaction time in healthy adults within 1 hour without the jitteriness typical of coffee. The combination of EGCG's metabolic effects and L-theanine's neuroprotective effects is why Japanese dementia rates in tea-drinking regions run measurably lower than global averages. Whisk 1 teaspoon of ceremonial-grade matcha into hot water, not boiling, and drink it in the morning. This is what the monks understood. Culinary-grade matcha, the duller powder in lattes and desserts, is heat-processed in ways that destroy much of the EGCG, which is why clinical results rarely reproduce with cheaper powders. And we arrive at number 1, natto, the fermented soybean dish so pungent and so polarizing that most first-time eaters can't finish a bite. And yet the data behind it is so overwhelming that researchers have spent decades trying to isolate its active compounds into pill form. Natto has been eaten in northern Japan for over 1,000 years, with some accounts tracing it to the Heian period warrior Minamoto no Yoshii, whose soldiers allegedly discovered it when boiled soybeans packed in straw fermented during a campaign. It became a breakfast staple of the long-lived farming regions of Ibaraki and Akita, where centenarian rates are among the highest in the country. Natto is made by fermenting soybeans with a specific bacterium, Bacillus subtilis natto, and the fermentation produces 2 compounds found nowhere else in the human food supply at meaningful concentrations. The first is nattokinase, a fibrinolytic enzyme that dissolves the fibrin strands responsible for blood clots. A 2015 clinical trial, published in Hypertension Research, showed that 2,000 fibrinol units of natto daily for 8 weeks reduced systolic blood pressure by over 5 points and decreased a key clotting factor in adults with mild hypertension. The second is vitamin K2 in the MK7 form, which natto contains at concentrations roughly 1,000 times higher than any other common food. K2 directs calcium away from arteries and into bones, and the landmark Dutch Rotterdam study found that adults in the top third of K2 intake had a 57% lower risk of death from coronary heart disease than those in the bottom third. A Japanese cohort study of over 90,000 adults published in 2020 linked regular natto consumption to a 21% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. Natto also provides probiotics, fiber, and bioactive peptides that lower inflammation. Eat it over rice with a small amount of soy sauce and mustard 3 or 4 mornings a week. This is the single most powerful item on this list. And no extract capsule has yet matched the whole food in head-to-head trials. The matrix of probiotics, K2, and peptides appears to work in ways the isolates lose. 10 foods, one quiet system that Japan built over 1,000 years of careful observation. The thread running through all of them, fermentation, pigment, mineral density, and enzyme preservation, is not accidental. It's a blueprint. Tell me in the comments which item surprised you the most. Was it the nattokinase behind number 1, or the monks grinding matcha for meditation at number 2? Like the video if it gave you something useful. Subscribe for more.